thank you all for being here. I'm so excited they have the opportunity to talk to you all about evaluation and assessment. This is one area of my work that I don't always get a lot of time to talk about. My students tell me to stop. And so I'm really excited that you're all here and willing to listen to me give you like a nice overview introduction. So I am Dr. Kawanna Bright. I am an assistant professor of library science at East Carolina University in lovely Greenville, North Carolina, not South Carolina, North Carolina. And what we're going to be doing today is the beginning of our foundations of evaluation and assessment in library settings, where we're doing part one. This is the getting to know you, getting to know all about you. You may all notice as we go through this presentation that there is a bit of a musical theme in some places. I do listen to a lot of different music. So if you're feeling like you want to be entertained, feel free to try to guess some of the artists that go along with the titles that I'm going to be flashing at you. So as I start, I do like to do a land and people acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge the Tuscarora people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Greenville consumes. I pay respect to 8 recognized tribes: the Kahari, Eastern Band of Cherokee, Haliwa Sapani, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi Band of Sapani, Sapani, and Wakamasuan, all nations and their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the enslaved peoples who worked and died on these lands and their descendants. Their pain and struggle made it possible for me to be with you today. I am their legacy. And this is actually adapted from the Ladonia Wright Cultural Center here at ECU, and I truly appreciate that they've created the base language for us to be able to use in different settings. So what we're going to be doing today, we're going to be talking about the difference between evaluation and assessment. And I'm going to make it very clear that this is from Dr. Bright's perspective, and that other people who do evaluation and assessment will argue with me, and that's perfectly fine. We can all argue about this and still get to the same point of using different techniques to answer different questions and to help us do the work we need to do. But I really want to talk about this in terms of how we apply it to libraries. I'm going to make sure we try to understand how evaluation and assessment impact library programming services and practices. And in other words, why we need to be doing this. And then also recognize the usefulness of things like conceptual frameworks and pre-planning for the success of evaluation and assessment processes. As I mentioned, this is going to be a fairly broad overview as we just talk about this and get some base understanding. And I hope many of you will return for part 2, where I'm going to actually start throwing some things at you that are more of, this is how we do it. And I think I even titled it, This is How We Do It. You can probably figure out which artist that one came from. So I'm actually going to get you to interact with me first, just a little bit, hopefully. I want you to tell me, what do you need to assess or evaluate in your work right now? What are the things that you're being asked to assess or evaluate in your work? So if you will actually head over to slido.com and use the code ACCESS1. Did I say access? It should be SS1. You should never listen to Dr. Bright. So yes, assess 1, not access 1. So digital programming, programs, collections use, data, what we need in a much smaller print. I see programs is probably going to be the largest thing that comes out of here. Course specific LibGuides, whether existing services should be continued or altered. Yes. Employees, in-class instruction, digital scholarship needs, meaningful reason to measure whatever's being assessed, engagement, team, class visits. Wow, this is all over the place. Collection age. Yep. Funding and spending. Ouch. Yes, we're talking a little bit about funding as well. Performance, everything. Yes, whoever typed that, you should have kept typing it just so we got that a little bit bigger, because yes, everything. We're being asked typically to assess everything. Just all the things, as we like to say. No, this is great. Thank you all so much. This is what I expected. Nothing unexpected coming up here. I'm seeing a lot of things that are typical of what we are looking at right now in our libraries and what we're stuck with. I think for a lot of you, the hardest ones are probably things like assessing staffing, assessing employees, assessing members. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward then. So let's have the conversation now about this whole evaluation, assessment. Is it both? What are we actually talking about here? And especially in libraries and LIS, we use them interchangeably. We tend to say evaluation, assessment in the same sentence sometimes when we're talking about sometimes slightly different things, because depending on the context and the intent of what you're doing, they may actually be very different, at least in terms of the process or what you're doing or the end result as well. So broadly speaking, assessment tends to focus on learning and looking at improvement more concretely, and is usually seen as being a little bit more objective, something you do in an objective way. Evaluation tends to focus on determining success of a program or your service or your collections, different things like that. And it tends to be more subjective, and a lot of people argue actually more judgmental in nature. However, we'll always be together. And that's because we tend not to separate these things out as much as we think we do. We, once again, interchangeably. And so UNLV University Libraries actually has a fairly robust assessment program, a really interesting page to look at. And they describe library assessment as the practice of evaluating library services, resources, spaces, and other areas. And so from this perspective, what we see is this idea that library assessment is the bigger piece and evaluation is maybe the process that they're using, right, to do the assessment. And that's definitely how some people look at it. They use the term evaluation in that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But once again, we sometimes conflate these things because we use them the same way. But you have a whole group of people out there who are doing evaluation research who are going to yell at you and say, stop using the term evaluating that way. And then also from CORE, which of course is our new group from ALA. Everybody loves to change the name, right? Where they talk about assessment as the measurement of your library resources and services in order to evaluate or improve them. So using assessment as the evaluation tool. And so I think we can see here that this process of trying to at least understand the distinction between the two is not as easy as it probably could be because we've always tended to use the terms interchangeably or back and forth. I've even read a few articles that have been published in the last 10, 15 years where they'll start out talking about assessment and halfway through their article, they're talking about evaluation and then they go back to assessment, but they didn't actually do anything that really justified changing the wording, but that's where it works. Now, fair warning. Evaluation and assessment are types of research. I am going to say that very loud, very clear. If you're like my students and me using the R word, research, scares you, please don't run away. I just want you to be aware that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is actually going to sound like research methods. And I'm going to even have a whole little section on research methodology because of how important it is to being able to do solid assessment, solid evaluation. Research and evaluation and assessments include questions that you hope to answer. You're likely going to have some type of hypothesis, and all that is you thinking what you're going to find or what you hope to find or expect to find. It's going to include participants or some type of sample or your stakeholders or the people you're working with or your users. All those different things are going to be included as well. You're definitely going to have some data collection and some data analysis, even if you don't call it that. Trust me, you're doing it. And then also, it better include some type of reporting or sharing out of your results. So you're not just doing this for the practice of doing it. You need to tell someone what you found. You need to share that information. And all those aspects are research. Basically, you're doing research. So don't be afraid. Don't be alarmed. I'm giving you fair warning. We're going to talk a little bit about research. Please don't run away. So I do want to go back and let's talk a little bit more about characteristics of evaluation. So this is going to help us make the distinction a little bit easier. You're still going to have some overlap. You're still going to switch. And I will promise you that at some point during this presentation, I'm going to switch and start saying evaluation when I mean assessment and assessment when I mean evaluation. It happens all the time. But if we're talking characteristics of evaluation, we're really talking about trying to appraise the merit of something or someone. And if you've had to go through an annual employee evaluation, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. And those are true hardcore evaluations that we go through. Usually you have to do this after some extended period of time so that you can actually determine the impact of what's been done. One of the mistakes that are often made is that we try to evaluate something when it hasn't been in place long enough to actually have time to have impact. And the question people usually ask is how much time? Well, standard is a year for most things. Give yourself a year. We do our annual employee evaluations yearly. But it also depends on what you're trying to evaluate. Some things can be evaluated at shorter periods of time. Some things can be evaluated at 6 months. Some things maybe even at 3 months. But you do want to be careful and aware of when you are evaluating something, because if enough time has not passed, you're not going to actually be able to determine whether or not you've had the impact that you wanted to actually have. Now, typically with evaluations, your results are going to be based on the comparisons that you're actually making to some previous set of goals or objectives that you've already set. So this is not just a case of looking at something after the fact. This is a case of you saying, these were the goals that we were shooting for, here were the objectives, and you're trying to make a comparison of what you actually finally got to and what you were hoping to get to. But you can also look at success in terms of how you did it and how well it was done. So a lot of people do that as well for evaluation. And it does tend to rely on a more summative reflection to inform decision making. So this idea that we are looking at the totality of what's there, reflecting on that, and then making our judgment about what we're actually seeing. So let's look at an example, and this is an evil example for me because this is my annual evaluation. So this is an example of the weights and goals document we use here for faculty at ECU. And for this particular document, I am expected to first decide how much weight to give to my teaching, my research, and my service. And then I'm expected to develop a set of goals for each of those sections, and usually 3 to 4 goals. They don't want to try to kill me. Yes, they do. But I usually set for myself 3 or 4 goals. So everything from me trying to create something for my students, a student conference, doing some solo or lead author submitted manuscripts. Some of this may sound familiar to some of you who have to do research in your work as well. Serving on committees, whether they're internal, external, national, international, it's standardized, right? So this is what I put forth at the beginning of the year. And this is what I talked to my supervisor about. And this is what I'm supposed to work on for the year. And then at the end of the year, I write up a lovely report detailing all the stuff I did for the year and basically explaining how I think I fit all those goals. Did I reach my goals? Or if I didn't reach my goals, explanation of why I didn't reach my goals, what happened, COVID, for in many ways. But then you see that there's this lovely form that I have to tell my supervisor where I think I fall on this range of numbers, and I give a number. Right. So I tell them that I think I was a 4.75. I'm outstanding, or I'm very good. I think I need to work on that. Then, of course, my supervisor picks their own numbers and hopefully they align with mine. So there is this quantitative aspect to this, which I think is hilarious. If you look at this form, it clearly says qualitative evaluation and has numbers attached to it. They're still trying to get away with that. It's a quantitative evaluation at this point. And so they give you the numerical equivalent. You see the weight that I actually gave it, and then you see the totals, and hopefully I received a number that I thought was good. Now, for me, we don't have merit pay, but for many people, a form like this also dictates whether or not they receive merit pay for the work they've done. And then in my case as well, there's also a nice long justification to explain why I was given a 4.52 for this particular year. And it usually matches whatever I wrote to give to my supervisor. But this is an example of a solid employee evaluation process that exists and probably looks very familiar to many of you, that for many of us is also seen as a torture device because we have to go through this process on a yearly basis. And the numbers often seem kind of arbitrary. This is very judgmental. They're looking at my work and they're basically judging me based on how well they think I thought I did and how well I also thought that I did. And we may not always agree because I think I'm doing a great job, but they may think that I need to do a little bit more work. But this is what that type of evaluation looks like. Now, moving over to assessment. Characteristics of assessment include being used to determine and communicate performance and also drive improvement. There's also this idea that you're now focusing on the stakeholders, and the goal is to make sure you're improving services to meet their needs. So whoever your stakeholders are, we're going to work to make sure you're meeting the needs of the stakeholders. And then, of course, that communication of results and the outcomes is a really important aspect because assessment is really seen as a very circular process, as is research. But with evaluation, there's this finality to it each year, right? I finished my evaluation, that's done. I'm starting over from scratch with a new evaluation. With assessment, there's not that sense of finality. There's that sense of this ongoing process that you're going through, and you're trying to figure out how to make improvements, how to make sure you've met a goal, but continue creating new goals and meeting new goals and so on and so forth. And this is why we have in a lot of our organizations and libraries, this culture of assessment that's being created. And within this culture of assessment, we typically rely on 2 things. We have this idea for evidence-based decision-making, which means any decision we make should only be made if we have the evidence to support making that decision. So of course, to get evidence, we have to gather data, do a little research. And there's also the importance of being user-centered. So we're paying attention to our users. Everything we're doing, this idea of improving is based on our users. Typically, they're the stakeholders when we talk about libraries and doing assessments for libraries. So an example of that, the one I like to look at actually comes from St. John's University. I actually like the way they describe their assessment projects. So they have both their 2021-22 projects and their previous projects, if anyone's interested in looking at them. But they have two projects they list here as part of their assessment. And notice they call them assessment projects. So that gives you a hint at the longevity that we're talking about here when we talk about assessment. And so they're planning on doing a data audit of St. John University libraries, where they're going to actually look at the data that's been collected and try to figure out what they're currently collecting, what's useful in documenting their contribution to strategic goals for the university, identify gaps in their data collection, and they admit that it's probably going to bleed over into 2022-23 academic year. I want to stop for a moment and say that regardless of what type of library you are working in, your library needs to do this project. This is a very important project, goes back to that cultural assessment thing, but also it's really important for your ability to be able to answer questions later on about your services and your programs. So if you have not done a data audit and developed a data plan for your library, I'm encouraging you to do that right now. All right. Back to our regularly scheduled programming. The other thing they're talking about here is doing an inclusive practices scan. And so the other part of my heart that does DEIAJ work is really happy to see this, because I think it's really important that they're paying attention to the fact that maybe they need to take a look at their practices and see if they're being as inclusive as they want to be. And so they're going to look at their collections, their culture, their instruction, their online access, and their services. Then they're also going to map this to their academic priorities, which is also a good idea. I think one of the more important things that St. John's is showing us here is the connection to larger things, those larger goals for the university, and then also their academic priorities that they've set for themselves as well. And it's important that we think about, especially with assessment, connecting to those larger goals. When we do evaluation, our goals tend to be a little more internal to the project, the program we're working on, to the employee that's being evaluated. When we talk about assessment, our goals tend to be a little bit larger, a little bit broader, a little bit bigger. And oftentimes we're connecting to things that are oftentimes outside of our control, that someone else has set those goals. Oftentimes the stakeholder has set those goals, and we're working with them to see if we've reached those goals or if we can align with those goals as part of our assessment as well. So just a really good example, I think, of different assessment projects and how logically this library is only focusing on two right now, because assessment projects are huge. And St. John's University Libraries is a large institution. So they're being logical here and saying, we're going to focus on these two things. And they're telling us flat out that one of them is probably going to take us a little bit longer than even just this 1 year that we're working on it. So for me, I'm nosy. I would probably continue checking in with them just to see how they're doing on that. But again, if you haven't done a data audit, please make sure you think about doing one. So at some point, you've probably heard people talk about the difference between formative and summative, whether they're talking about assessment or evaluation, doesn't matter at this point. But I like to try to break it down in a way that I think it's easier to understand. So if you're checking on your program or your service or your activity throughout its existence and then making changes as you go, then you're probably doing either formative or a formative assessment or a formative evaluation. If you're checking on your program or your service or your activity at the end of its existence and making changes or making a decision based on what you find at that point, then you're probably talking about something that is summative in nature. That's the way I think about it. That to me makes it a little bit easier to, when people ask me if I'm doing a formative or doing summative. Notice I didn't say which was best. I'm not going to get into that argument today. A lot of people will argue that you should always do formative, and other people say, but summative is the way to go as well. I think there's a place for both when you do assessment and evaluation, and that we need to recognize what they look like. So a couple of examples here. At the end of the class, if you ask them to write out the 3 things they learned, or if you ask them to write a short essay, or if you ask them to do a completed worksheet and turn that into you, then you are probably doing ding, 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 summative, right? All right. If during the class you have some learning checkpoints set up, and you're changing things based on what you hear, if you are asking them to do demonstration of knowledge and then adding more information if they don't quite understand or can't do the demonstration of knowledge, if you're doing the peer-to-peer process where they're trying to teach each other and you're overhearing or hearing as they're presenting that things aren't quite right, so you're making some changes, then you are definitely doing formative. And that's just going to be kind of a clear-cut way to think about it for instruction sessions. Now, the real question is, based on what I just said, and just to give you a break and give me a break to get something to drink, back to our Slido, and this should be assess 1, not access 1. Again, ignore me, I cannot type properly. But were these examples of evaluation or were they examples of assessment that I just showed you? So at the end of class, 3 things you learned, short essay, completed worksheet, learning checkpoints, demonstration of knowledge, or peer-to-peer. And we're curious whether or not these are examples of evaluation or examples of assessment. All right, I'm seeing evaluation. I'm seeing both. Seeing a few people say assessment. Okay, it's a race, both. Evaluation, assessment. Okay. Most people are leaning towards both. Evaluation, assessment. Okay. No one's choosing more information needed to determine. Interesting. I'm going to say that based on everything I've told you today, that you can argue that this is either evaluation or assessment, and that you probably actually need more information before you try to determine. So, trick question, I know, I'm evil, but I just wanted to give you a chance to kind of think about that a little bit, since we were talking really more about the summative formative than we were talking about evaluation assessment. All right, thank you all for indulging me. That should be the last one of those monstrosities. You won't have to do that again today. All right, so rewind. Just want to share this lovely chart that I found that I thought was a really nice way to do a comparison of assessment evaluation and talk about those important pieces. So this idea about assessment being this process of collecting and reviewing and using that data to improve performance versus evaluation being this act of passing judgment. We talk about the judgmental status of it in terms of those set of standards, those goals you've already set. And of course, assessment is seen as being more diagnostic versus the judgmental process of evaluation. Assessment providing feedback on performance and areas of improvement, but evaluation determining the extent to whether you've achieved or met those objectives or goals. And then yes, assessment does tend to be formative in nature. It's just the way it's structured, because as you mentioned about assessment, it's kind of circular process. It's going to be formative. It's very hard to do a summative assessment, but evaluation does tend to be summative. Evaluation can be formative, but it does tend to be summative in nature. Assessment is more process oriented. Evaluation is more product oriented. And then assessment typically is based more on observations and positive, negative points that you find as you're going through things, trying to find those barriers, trying to find the strengths and weaknesses. Evaluation usually based more on the quality, that standard that was set. Did you reach that quality level? So assessment is a little more reflective in nature, while evaluation is more prescriptive in nature. And in terms of the criteria, typically assessment is going to be set by both those doing the evaluation and the stakeholders. Evaluation is usually set by some evaluator. So someone at ECU set that evaluation form up, had nothing to do with me. So I would change that form if I had the option. And then of course, in terms of the measurement standards, assessment measurements tend to be very absolute, but evaluation standards tend to be a little bit more comparative in nature. So kind of a nice way just to have a chart to help you see where you might classify a few things. After all that talking, and after asking you what you were evaluating and talking about the difference between assessment and evaluation, we stopped to think about why we assess and or evaluate. And I think you all would look at all of these and say yes to all. We spend a lot of time doing assessments and evaluations, though, because we're trying to prove our worth. We're trying to show others that we need libraries and we need librarians and we need all these resources and we need money to continue providing these things. And the demands on us now to provide more and more data-driven, especially information to support our request for funding is worse than it used to be. It's harder for us now than it used to be. And also to request that money, to get that funding. We're spending a lot of time having to do the assessments and do the evaluations, to write the reports and then request the funding. But we also do this to support our user needs. We do this because we recognize sometimes that there are things our users need that we don't think about. And so we spend time assessing our projects and our different programs and trying to make sure we're actually in support of their needs. I'm sure I'm not the only librarian who has spent hours of my life creating a fantastic program, only to have no one show up for it. And sit there wondering, why did this not happen? Why didn't it make? Why didn't anybody show up? And realizing later on that it's because maybe I was not actually supporting the needs of my users. I was maybe supporting a need I thought they had, but maybe not a need they actually did have. We need to do this to improve our services. Our services are not perfect, even though we'd like to think they are. There are oftentimes glitches in the way we do things. And if we ask our users, they will let us know. So we need to find out how to improve our services. We need to make sure we're making changes in our organizations. And sometimes those changes are internal as well. We talk a lot about making sure that we are making changes to our organizations so that they're welcoming to the people who work in the organizations as well, and to identify those barriers and those strengths that we have so that we know what we're working with and we also know we need to work on as well. But also, let's be honest, there are reasons why we don't assess or evaluate. There are barriers to the process of doing this. Lack of time is one of the biggest ones. We all struggle with this. I recognize that most of you are working 2 jobs in one, if not more than that. And trying to find a time to do true assessment and true evaluation can be very difficult. There's also this sense of lack of resources. You may not necessarily have the people and the funds and the other things you need to do a full assessment, to do an evaluation. You may be struggling with your confidence. Maybe that's why you're here right now, that you're just not quite sure that you can do this type of work. You can, by the way, but maybe there's that sense of, I'm not ready to do this and I'm being asked to do this. And then also that lack of know-how, which we know goes with the lack of confidence. If you haven't been trained in research, if you haven't been trained in evaluation and assessment, it can just feel like it's too big. I don't know how to do these different things. And so what I'm going to devote the last part of this to is making sure we have time to talk about at least an initial introduction to this idea of some tools for you, things to think about. And as I said, for part 2, we're going to spend more time on that as well. So, tools and techniques that we can helpfully apply to evaluation assessment in our libraries. And I'm going to start out with the scary ones because that's the best way to do it. Just pull the Band-Aid off. Research methods. We're going to talk about the importance of all the lovely research methods you can apply to doing evaluations and assessments. So starting out with quantitative, I call this the count on me process. You can do descriptive, you can do inferential. And of course, what I mean by descriptive is just how many people said what, how many people checked out books, what percentages do I have? For those who want to get crazy and do the inferential, that's where you start comparing things. Start looking at your undergrads versus your grad students. Start looking at your seniors versus your youth versus your kids in terms of use of space and things like that. We have a lot of quantitative data available to us in libraries already, because for the most part, we've set up most of our new systems to count things and collect things for us, right? And in many cases, it's counting and collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of information for you. Whether you know what to do with that is a whole different question. I always, with my students, talk about the fact that there's the public libraries survey that goes out, and the amount of data available about public libraries that could be crunched and used to find out and determine things is amazing, and it's right there. It's just data that's sitting there. But that's what we have access to, and there's so much we can do with it if we have the know-how and we know it's there and we can get to it. But you don't want to count on just quantitative data. You do want to consider the qualitative data that's out there as well. Quantitative data will give you one view of what's happening in your library. It'll give you a sliver, one perspective of what's happening. Qualitative data will give you another view of what's happening in your library. And so I call this the everybody talks type of data. And it's not all about talking, but it is this idea of surveying and doing interviews and focus groups so that you can actually have that direct conversation. It's observation, it's spending time looking at how spaces and things are being used. It's the usability testing that we're seeing more and more and more in libraries. We've been doing it for years, but now it's becoming more commonplace for us to do usability testing of especially our, the OPACs and things that we still have that don't always work the way we want them to. And then also the user experience that we're starting to see, where we're actually hiring people and librarians who have training and user experience so they can actually focus on that. When I worked at University of Texas, San Antonio, we had 2 user experience librarians, one who focused more on the web and one who's focused more on the people aspect of things. And they worked well together. So it was an acknowledgement that we needed both perspectives, and they both had different backgrounds, and it worked out. But not everybody has that training and availability, but that's what the qualitative will do for you as well. Now, I include mixed methods up here, partly because I think mixed methods is just the best way to go in terms of doing research. Okay, I'm a little biased, I'll admit it. I call it the powers of both approaches, but this is the give me everything approach or the I want it all approach, because I do want it all. I want both the quantitative and the qualitative. I want all the stories, I want all the perspectives, I want all the pictures, I want everything together. One of the best ways to think about mixed methods is to think about the idea of having 2 fishing nets. And this was a really great analogy I read in a book, and I need to remember which book it was. But it's the idea of having 2 fishing nets, and both fishing nets have a hole in it, but those holes are in different spots. If you use each fishing net by itself, you're going to lose fish because they're getting through the hole. But if you overlap those fishing nets in a way where they are covering up the holes of each other, then you're going to lose fewer fish. You're going to catch more fish. It's just a better option. Well, that's what mixed methods does for you. It basically covers up the holes that quantitative and qualitative research each have as standalone approaches and gives you a little bit more power, a little bit more ability to answer questions or to tell a story or to find the answer that you're trying to find. All right, so I'll get off my soapbox. I know I love mixed methods, but I just like to make sure I put that out there as well. The other thing I want to talk about is something that scares people because it's a lot of work, or at least it sounds like a lot of work. And it's the idea of creating a conceptual framework to do your assessment or your evaluation. What conceptual frameworks are just guides. They're something to guide you through your process. You may see them called logic models, assessment frameworks, models of change. So if you're doing a Google search and you're trying to find a conceptual framework, especially for an evaluation, especially an evaluation of instruction, you may have to use a few different terms as well. But these are usually visual things that show the connections from the activities you're engaging in to the outcomes that you're hopefully expecting to find for your assessment process. They also need to be flexible, or should be flexible, because they're probably going to shift and change as you go through your assessment process. And notice I did specifically say assessment there. And that's because of the fact that if something is being more flexible and shifting and changing, it means you're checking on it throughout the process. And that's definitely going to be probably assessment more than evaluation at that time. But you can change a conceptual framework. You're not married to the one you have, right? The one that you have that you start with may not be working for you, and you may need to actually make some changes. So if you wanted to build a conceptual framework, typically it's just like a step-by-step process. You start out by describing the intended use of the framework. What are we planning on doing with it? Then you outline your initiative's vision and mission. Now, if you're talking about an initiative that is a specific program that you're assessing or evaluating, then you probably will have a specific vision mission for it. But oftentimes your vision mission is actually going to be the larger vision or mission of your organization. It's not necessarily going to be that I did this program and I have a specific vision or mission for my program, but I have a vision and mission that work for my organization, and that helps me when I'm looking at creating programming or creating services as well. You're going to make sure you state the initiative's objective. So why is this initiative in place? Why is this program in place? Why is this service in place? And then usually as part of those objectives, you also talk about what you can measure, the anticipated measurable results, any assumptions you have about barriers, any hypotheses you have about potential findings. You should go ahead and write all that out. And then you describe the scope of the framework. And scope is just what does the framework cover and what does it not cover? So that's helping you to create those boundaries of what you're going to be looking for. And then you spend some time identifying what goes in there, all the different components, all the things that you're going to have. That includes the people, the things, the resources, all that stuff that just gets chucked into the whole process. And you use those components to create your visual diagram. So build it up, create it that way. Once you have a diagram, you check it. Always test it, and usually means you go find a case to check it on. So you find a program that maybe already happened and you test out your conceptual framework to see if it works for you. And then you use it if it works. If it doesn't quite work, you adapt it as you need to and check it again, and then go apply it as you need to. I figured this might be easier if I showed you an example of other people who've created these. So I do have two examples. One I think is much clearer to most people. The other one is just more to show you how it's just a visual way of showing what people are thinking about in terms of their projects. So this example right here is a food bank logic model, and they list specifically their vision and mission for the food bank. And of course, for them, their vision is a community where all residents are free from hunger, and their mission is to end hunger in their community by increasing access to healthy foods, reducing barriers to health and well-being, and cultivating self-sufficiency. And so what you expect to see when you have a vision and mission like this is a lot of those terms and a lot of those things are going to end up inside of their conceptual framework. But they also give you a little bit more context. So their context tells you that local residents experience increased rates of food insecurity and poverty, so growing community support to provide not only relief efforts, but to invest in prevention. I think the context is important for understanding what they're trying to do, and that's why they're including that context there. You may not need context if yours is an internal document, but I think it's nice that they included that context as well. But the meat of this, of course, are this middle section. And you probably noticed, I said this is visual. This is basically just tables that are bulleted, right? But they have them labeled and they have them colorful, and they're just making sure they have this visual way of looking at this. But what they're giving you are the inputs, the activities, their short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And if you look at the inputs, this is what when you hear someone say input, what they're talking about are all the resources they have. So they're talking about their community support, their donors, their website, their funding plan, their facilities. So they're talking about the people, the places, and the things that they have access to that are involved in this whole process. When they talk about activities, they specifically talk about what they are doing or plan to do. So they're talking about information and education to increase community awareness. They're talking about expanding partnerships. They're talking about providing clients with referral resources. They're just giving you the list of the activities they're engaged in that are going to help them to reach their outcomes. And then I do like how they broke this down to short-term, intermediate, long-term outcomes, because it helps you to see what they're truly working on. And so they're talking about increased community awareness. That's just a short-term outcome. Intermediate, they don't have as many. They're talking about policy and system environmental changes. Intermediate things are going to be a little bit harder to get to. And then for the long term, of course, they're trying to get to those reduced rates of household food insecurity. Those are the big picture things they're trying to get to. I think this is just a nice way for them to be able to show visually, though, how they get from these are the resources we have access to. These are the activities we're engaged in, and this is what we're trying to actually get out of this. And so you can do this for a program that you created. You can do this for a service for the library, same way they've done it. Talk about your inputs, talk about your activities, and then talk about what outcomes or goals you're hoping to reach at the end of that as well. Now, I actually find this one not to be as useful in terms of explaining anything, but I wanted to show you that some people just put these together as a visual thing. It's just a visual. It's just showing you that they're talking about the organizational performance of their library reader service that they're doing. And they do something called a 4S process here, where they talk about the scope, the site, the synergy, and the system. This makes more sense if you read the entire article, which is why I think the other one's a much better example. But I did want to just show you that for some people, conceptual framework is something as basic as this, where they don't even list out the measures that are important to them, which would be more useful to you if you were looking at this versus someone who's just having to read the article. But they're just letting you know that they're trying to act on strategic direction for readers, provide a suitable channel with their readers, gain the loyalty of their readers, and then support in the library use of readers. That's all they're trying to do. I would definitely suggest going more with the food bank plan if you're going in that direction, and a little less with this, which is more of just I think they slapped it together for an article. But I wanted to show you that some people do this and call these conceptual frameworks as well, which is what they did. All right, so the other thing I wanted to talk about was pre-planning. And really for me, all pre-planning is answering every question that needs to be answered. 21 questions in this point. I don't actually have 21, but I'm pretty darn close. So you're asking yourself, first of all, am I evaluating or assessing? More than likely now, most of you probably figure out you're doing a combination of both, probably some assessment, some evaluation thrown in as well. You need to figure out what your goal is or what the purpose is of your process, and then figure out what resources you have access to. What are those inputs that you have? And then what resources do you need if you don't already have access to them? Also identify your assets and your barriers. So what do you got going for you, and what do you got going against you? Who are your stakeholders? Who are your users? Who are the people that you're most invested in that you really need to focus on? And then what's your conceptual framework? Yes, I'm encouraging you to go ahead and think about creating that. But what approaches are you going to use? Are you going to do more quantitative, more qualitative, more mixed methods? You're going to try some combination of all those different things. What's your timeline and your time frame that you're going to try to complete this in? Are you going to be able to do like St. John's and say, I'm going to have a year, but it's probably going to take 2 years? Is it going to be 3 years? Is it 6 months? Make sure you have that thought in your head as well. And then what will be the outcome or output of what you're actually going to do, this process? And then how are you going to use that output? How are you going to put it in place? If you're doing an assessment, the goal is, of course, that you're improving something. So you're making changes with this, right? If you're doing an evaluation, then you're making a decision. Are we going to continue doing this service? Are we going to stop doing this service? Those are going to be the most key important pieces of the in output of what you have. So no matter what, if you go through this process, you need to make sure that you do something with the information, with the return of what you have. All right, so our wrap up for this session, just a reminder, evaluation and assessment both have value, are important for libraries. You already know this. A strong understanding of research methods is beneficial, but it's not a necessary condition for you to be able to do this work, right? You can go and learn how to do basic data collection, basic data analysis. I can always point you to some great resources for that as well. Multiple approaches are available to you, and I'm going to tell you to mix and match as much as you need to get the answers you want for your assessments, for your library, for what you're trying to do. But I'm really going to encourage you to do that pre-planning, to sit down and answer those questions, to create those conceptual frameworks, because I think they're really going to help you to support the efforts that you have, and make it a little bit easier for you to see where you do have questions or you do have things that you're concerned about. You do have major barriers, or you do have a lot of great assets out there. It's a really good exercise for you to have those conversations as well in the library about where the skill sets are. Who has some skill sets in research methodology, who also has an interest and a love of doing that and really wants to be involved. It's a great way to also get all levels of employees involved, because sometimes you'll have multiple people at multiple levels who want to do the work, but you may not have known that before you started asking yourself your 21 questions that you have there. So just a quick review of part two. We're going to actually talk more about things like data collection and analysis techniques. So we're going to start digging into that a little bit, mostly to talk about how to select the appropriate method to align with your project. So how do I make sure that if I'm doing this project, I'm trying to assess this project, how should I do that, right? Which method should I choose? We're also going to talk about something that I think is really important for us to think about, which is being more inclusive when we do this work. So participatory approaches to evaluation and assessment that include our stakeholders in that process and aren't just us standing over on the outside kind of gathering data and making judgments and doing things kind of to them. It's more of with them rather than to. And then also identifying potential opportunities for actually implementing the results. So once you get this information, you do this stuff, you get the output, what do I do with it? And we're going to talk a little bit about that to make sure you don't feel like you wasted your time and your energy and your resources going through this process, because you want to have that positive outcome at the end. Thank you so much.